Seth, and I'm continuing our series on the words of the Bible, and we're finally going to apply some of what we've learned in the other videos as we seek to become better Bible readers. I want to talk about the word workmanship in Ephesians 2:10. And just by how I said that, I want us to remember what we learned in our previous videos, that context controls meaning. When we do a word study, we're not searching for the root meaning or the literal meaning that we can then take and apply in any context where we find that word. Rather, we want to know what the word means in this specific context. So I'm going to take the 3-step word study method from the Introduction to Biblical Interpretation, and we have already completed step 1. That is, select words that require detailed analysis. I love Ephesians chapter 2, especially the first 10 verses. Verse 10 says, "We are his workmanship." That's how it reads in the Christian Standard Bible. Or, "We are his handiwork," or "we are God's handiwork" in the NIV. So as a believer, I should care what Paul means by this word handiwork or workmanship. So we'll do a brief study of that word. Now, in studying Ephesians 2:10, we could also do a word study on created or good works or prepared, or even the word that's translated for us to do. But in this video, we're going to look at workmanship. Using stepbible.org, I can look up Ephesians 2:10, hover over workmanship, and see that we're going to study the Greek word poema. And that brings us to our second step in our word study. Determine the range of meaning for the word. That's step 2 from Introduction to Biblical Interpretation. Or, as we learned in our last video, we need to identify the word's semantic range. A valuable shortcut is to look up this verse in several translations, and that's a great practice anytime you're doing Bible study. We've already seen the words handiwork and workmanship in the NIV and the CSB, but the HCSB has creation. The NRSV has what he has made. The Net Bible says his creative work. And the New Living Translation has masterpiece. This is not the true semantic range of the word, but it still gives us a good idea of what various scholars think the word could mean in this context. To find the semantic range of a word in the New Testament, we should look up the word poema in BDAG. And if we look there, we'll find the possible translations: that which is made, work, creation. And there we would find out that this noun is actually only used twice in the New Testament. The other reference is by Paul in Romans 1:20, where it says, "God's invisible qualities have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made." Because this word only appears twice in the New Testament, we have a pretty narrow range of meaning to work with. But it's important to recognize that the New Testament was written in the broader context of the first century Greek language. So how do we know the fuller range of meaning for a word? 2 starting points to study a word in the broader Greek language are Liddell and Scott's lexicon, which is a larger lexicon than BDAG and includes uses outside of the New Testament, and also the Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint or the LXX. And we can get touch points to both of those sources using stepbible.org. So first, I look up Ephesians 2:10 and click on workmanship, and Step Bible will show me a significantly abbreviated entry for the Greek word from Liddell and Scott. It'll list the possible translations that are from that lexicon. And we can see from Liddell and Scott the possible meanings of what is made, workmanship, creation, that which is made or done, a work, workmanship, creation. I can read further in the entry to see the possible meanings of work, invention, production, poem, verse, poetic or metrical form, fiction, onomatopoeic word, deed, or act. So we can see that this word is very polysemous. That is, it does have a wide range of meanings. Now, the temptation for preachers and authors is to simply pick the translation that works best with the point that they're trying to make. Don't do that. We want to know what Paul intended by using the word poema. The second way to see the semantic range of a word outside the New Testament is see how it was used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament or the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. This will also help us with our third step of the word study, which I'll explain in a minute. To study the word poema in the Septuagint, I need to go back to stepbible.org. I can click on the little arrow next to the translation and find the list of ancient translations and select the LXX. That is the Septuagint. Then I can type poema in the search bar. Unless you're very proficient in Greek, it's helpful to include the ESV or another English translation in your search. And as I scroll through these occurrences in the Septuagint, I can see that the dominant way poema was used in the Greek Old Testament was as works or deeds, often specifically accomplished by the doer's hands, so works of their hands. And we can see that the deeds or works could be both evil or good. But either way, they're often a source of pride or acclaim or accomplishment for the one who did them. So this brings us to step 3. We need to select the meaning that best fits the context. And this is the most crucial step. Now, it's more of an art than a science. And normally we would want to consider how the author usually uses this word. So we look at the other examples. Well, in this case, we only have one other use from Paul. So we don't have a lot of information about how Paul usually used this word. So I'm going to make the informed assumption that Paul is using this word consistent with how he would have read it used in the Septuagint. Furthermore, we want to find the meaning that best fits our immediate context in Ephesians 2. In verses 8 and 9, Paul has reminded the Ephesians that their salvation is an act of God's grace, received through faith. And they can't take credit for their salvation or their efforts or their works because it's not by their works. It's a gift from God. So verse 10 creates a contrast. Rather than our works being something that we can boast in based on our own efforts, Paul wants us to know that God is the one who has made us what we are. So what can we conclude from this study of poema? We can be confident that poema is about the fact that God deliberately made us. Nobody else made us. We're not what we have made ourselves. We're what God has made us. And we can suspect with a little less certainty that Paul wants us to consider the special skill or careful crafting and attention that God used to make us what we are. That interpretation would be consistent with what we read in Ecclesiastes 2:4, Ecclesiastes 3:11, and 3:22. And more importantly, it would be consistent with the imagery in Isaiah of God being the potter working with the clay in Isaiah 29:16. So while we can't definitively say for sure that Paul was comparing God to a skilled craftsman, we can be pretty confident that Paul was saying we are what we are by God's actions, not by our own. And then we can pretty confidently rule out that Paul wanted us to think of ourselves as God's poem. Poema could be used to refer to what we now call poetry, and is in fact where we got the word poem. But poema had a much broader semantic range, as we've seen, and was much more often used to mean something made than to mean a lyrical work of literature. So to claim Paul meant we are God's poem actually commits two semantic fallacies or misunderstandings. First, it assumes that a later meaning of a word, so the English word poem, can be carried back into the ancient use of the word. It's the same fallacy that happens when people talk about God's explosive power, because the word that was used to name TNT dynamite comes from the Greek word for power and ability. But the Greeks had no concept of dynamite, so we can't apply that meaning back to an ancient culture, just like we can't apply our understanding of English poetry back to Paul's use of poema. That's sometimes called semantic anachronism or reverse etymology. The second problem with assuming poema in Ephesians 2:10 can be understood as poem is that it assumes that just because a word can mean something in some context, that you can apply it or transfer that meaning to another context. So to borrow an example from our last video, if I told the kids a pool is shallow or the water is shallow, they shouldn't assume I'm making a criticism of the pool just because they may have heard me in another context say that book is shallow. They would know that I'm using the word to mean two different things because it's two different contexts. Likewise, it's illegitimate to take the meaning of poem, even though poema could sometimes mean poem, and transfer that to our context in 2:10. And that's why this fallacy is sometimes called illegitimate totality transfer, because you're illegitimately taking one meaning from all the possible meanings of a word and assuming you can apply it in any other context. And that's not how words work, and that's not how we should understand the words of the Bible. So, with this understanding of poema in Ephesians 2:10, let us commit ourselves to the good works that God has made us for, because we are God's workmanship, and we know our salvation is entirely a gracious gift from God that we get to then live out in gratitude for all that God has done for us. Let me know if there's another word that you would like to understand in a specific context as we work together to become better Bible readers.